The year was really hard emotionally on me,
Mhm.
um, but my kids were flourishing. And here's the crazy thing. I had been a stay-at-home mom. I planned to go on law school after college, like my dad, so we could work together.
Mm.
And there were two things I said I'd never do in college. One was teach, and the other was have kids. And so I spent my adult life teaching my kids at home, or at least 21 years of it, which I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. It's the most fulfilling life I can ever imagine.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoy the program.
Greetings, I'm Jim Mason, Vice President at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is Homeschool Talks. Today I'm very excited to have as my guest a very old friend. I've known Zan for a long time, and it's just been my privilege to get to know her over the years, and her husband Joe. And today, so we're doing a new thing here on Homeschool Talks, Zan, and you're our experimental person. We are going to do a double podcast. So when you're listening to me doing this introduction today, this is just going to be part one, but we want you to stick around, and we're going to make this into two separate podcasts. And the first episode podcast is going to be getting to know Zan Tyler for all of the amazing things that got her to where she is today. And then next episode, we're going to talk to her about the things she's involved with now and try to get her outlook for the future of homeschool freedom and the homeschool movement. So Zan, tell us about yourself. Ha! So one of the things that I'm most excited about is learning about your early experiences with your children and your desire to homeschool them, and how South Carolina just totally went along with all of your requests and desires, and you became kind of the archetypal homeschool mom. So let's go back, way back to the beginning.
Okay. Well, it was in the 80s. And I had my oldest son. I had two boys at the time. Ty was 6 and John was 4. And my oldest son was the only one in his kindergarten class, so I guess he was 5 then, who was not reading. But I knew he was very bright and very gregarious. I just couldn't figure out what was wrong. So a friend of mine who had her master's degree in education recommended that I get him tested and just hold him back a year, which seems like a very easy process once I had him tested. And the principal at the local school, public school, agreed to the plan to hold him back. In the meantime, a good friend of mine that I met together with just prayer and Bible study once a week. I was a young mom. I'd graduated from college and had children right away. And so my friend Susan had taught for many years, and we were talking about Ty and where to go to school. And there was a Christian school, but the curriculum would have been terrible for him. And she said, Zan, I think you ought to homeschool. Well, this is 1984, very George Orwellian. And the only thing I had ever heard about homeschooling was one group in Mississippi that bartered and wouldn't even use money. So that was my brief exposure to the world of homeschooling. And she said homeschooling, and I thought I might just die right there in her little apartment where they were they were both getting their master's in seminary to go to the mission field.
So let me just touch base on that. The 1984. So Debbie and I got married in 1985,
Okay.
and as we were approaching our wedding day, she told me, "I think we want to homeschool our kids." and being, above average bright in some ways, I could discern what homeschool meant kind of from the context.
Yeah.
But I had never heard of anybody actually doing it. And,
Yes.
and had not, I knew one family that I learned later learned that they were homeschooling. So 1984 was kind of a I mean, that's part of why I want to talk to you. We're going back in time to a time, in a time capsule that most people today who are just beginning homeschooling have no idea existed. They have no idea what it was really like back then.
That's right. Well, what you say, Jim, is so true. We didn't know one person in the world who homeschooled when we were getting started. I mean, today you would have social media, you could find people. We didn't know anybody. And it was, to say that it would be considered bizarre was the understatement. When Joe and I decided, I read this book, Homegrown Kids, and it was really just like the Holy Spirit was just saying, Zan, this is what I want you to do with Ty. And I was thinking, I can't do this in the 1980s, but I was so fascinated with the concept of homeschooling. It just sounded like this is the way I want to raise and teach my children. Parents involved, time for service, positive socialization. It just sounded fascinating. But we met with Roadblocks right away. The first thing that happened was we couldn't even get the school board or the state board of education to give us the application or the law for homeschooling. So we right off the bat had to hire an attorney, and just finding an attorney in the 80s who had ever heard the word homeschooling, much less could defend us, was a stretch. That's why I am such a believer in Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Every parent, I know this is not why you have me on the air, but every parent who homeschools needs to join. I know the pain. You can't walk into somebody's office for $115 or $130. And so that was traumatic. So then we finally hired the attorney. We got the law. I spent 6 weeks researching how you comply with this vague substantial equivalence law, which we don't even know what that means. So how can you comply with it? Then the school board turned me down. They said I'd followed the law. They didn't care. They were making a statement to the State Board of Education that they shouldn't have to deal with this.
So let's go back. So homeschooling was kind of technically legal if you said substantial equivalence. What did that mean exactly, or what were they saying it meant, and practically what did it mean?
They just said that I had to prove that my education the education I was planning to give my kids in my home was substantially equivalent to what kids in public school receive. Well, now I don't know how you do that. So, when they turned me down, they wanted to say it's because I was not certified. But then I found a Christian school in our district that didn't require certified teachers. So that was kind of let me off that hook. And I just had to use the curriculum they were using to prove that I had substantial equivalence with somebody remotely in the district. And, it's a vague standard. You can't prove that. I mean, I don't want my education to be substantially equivalent in the first place. I didn't know that then. I was very naive and thought that they were from the government and here to help. And that didn't last very long. So then the school board just denied me. They didn't care. I tried to meet with one of our school board members ahead of time that I had a vague notion of knowing. Columbia was a small town at the time. He said, Zan, I can't meet with you before that hearing because what did he say? It might prejudice me to vote in favor of you.
That'd be horrible.
Oh, that would be terrible. And I said, have you ever heard of the concept of taxation without representation? Let's go back in time here. So
you said two things that go back into the deep, dark history of homeschooling, and the substantial equivalence. That was the standard in a lot of states that was almost impossible for people to meet. And the other problem with it was nobody really knew what it meant. And so in one district, you might have a friendly guy and, oh yeah, that's substantial equivalence. And then just, a block over in the next school district, another guy says, no, that's not substantial equivalence. And the other was teacher certification. I mean, the early days of homeschooling, everybody thought that you could not teach children without having a degree or diploma from a state teaching college and get a teaching license.
That's right. That's right.
So you're in Columbia, South Carolina in 1984, and you have done your level best to provide proof that you're going to provide substantial equivalence. You've gotten around the teacher certification. They denied you. Did they tell you why?
They basically said later. They didn't tell me at that point in time, because Joe and I had not told our parents. I mean, Joe's parents lived a half a mile from us. My parents lived 3 miles from me. We didn't tell anybody we were planning to homeschool at all. We just figured it would come out eventually that our kids weren't on the school bus. But I was not ready to have that conversation, and for good reason. So they just denied me. They said later, as homeschooling grew more in clout and became a movement, that they were trying to send a message to the State Department of Education that this shouldn't be in their bailiwick. They didn't want to handle it. They didn't have the resources to handle it. That's not how it came out at the time, however. So I hired my attorney again, and I said, they've turned me down. What do I do? And he said, well, you appeal to the State Board of Education, where they will rubber stamp what the school district did. And then I said, and then what? He said, you'll end up in family court. And I'm telling the Lord every night as I'm praying through this, I told you this was not a good idea. And so I had this brainstorm in the middle of all of this. My mom had been actually an excellent public school teacher. And when Charlie Williams, who was then the state superintendent of education, was getting his PhD, he observed my mom's classroom. And I knew him because she taught the 4th grade. I was in the 4th grade class across the hall. And I would come in every day to wait for Mom to get ready to go home. And Dr. Williams would be there. And he loved my mother. She was a great teacher. So by now he's superintendent of education for South Carolina. And I called him up and I said, Dr. Williams, this is Zan Tyler. I'm Sybil Peters' daughter. I have a problem. Can I come see you? He says, honey, I'll clear my calendar. Come up right now. And, this is a friend. And so I get up there, and this is what I'm expecting, Jim. I'm expecting to tell him, I didn't give you the whole story, that I wanted to hold my son back. I have the testing. The district agreed to it. All of a sudden, they said, you can't hold your child back. You have to put him in 1st grade. I said, I'm not doing that. Private schools were filled at this point in time. It's May, early June. And so I guess I'm going to have to homeschool. So that's really what forced my hand to homeschool. So I think I'm going in to tell Dr. Williams, this is not my fault. I love my child. I've had him tested. I've done my due diligence. This is what's best for him. And putting him in 1st grade is not best for him. The school district reneged. Then the school board turned me down for homeschooling. And here I am. I thought Dr. Williams was going to say, Zan, I know you. I know you are a parent who loves your child. What can I do to help? Instead, he looks at me and he says, well, Zan, if you continue down this path of homeschooling, I'll have you put in jail for truancy.
So this was your dear friend, somebody that you trusted from childhood. And he threatened to put you in jail.
Yes. Now, dear friend may be,
well,
you know what I'm saying. Just in the
He was somebody from your childhood that you looked up to and respected and thought would give you a good.
And he really respected my mother. And that was the same thing that had happened in my district. My associate superintendent of education had been my high school principal. And, there was no help there either. And I had been, I went to a new high school. I had won several major statewide awards while I was there and brought really good publicity to the high school. I mean, I knew these people. I worked with the administration. So I wasn't, I was shocked by all of this. And I mean, at the heart of me, I love people and I'm an extrovert. And I just couldn't believe all this was happening.
So when Dr. Williams said that, did he give you the steely-eyed glaze and glared at you, or did he give you a further explanation? Or
it was very intimidating. And, for me, as a 28-year-old mom, I'm thinking, well, he said he can put me in jail. He's going to put me in jail. My hearing with the state board was the next week. And so I'm thinking it would probably be after that hearing when I had been assured from several different sources that they would also deny my application. So at this point, I felt like I should go tell my parents what was going on, because they were very active in the community, and my dad especially. Mom had been a teacher. She was very well respected. Dad was very involved in the community in South Carolina, and he was respected and loved and feared a little bit, and admired. So I thought, I don't want him to read about it in the newspaper. It wouldn't say Zan Tyler, peon homeschool mom, goes to jail. It would say John Peter's daughter goes to jail for truancy. So I went. I just thought, well, I've got to go tell him. So I left there. And as I'm talking to Dr. Williams, he just let the statement hang and didn't say anything else to me. So I looked at him and I said, well, Dr. Williams, you'll just have to put me in jail then. And I got up and I left. It was really, not to be overly dramatic, it was my give me liberty or give me death moment. And it was like a split second. I had to decide how to respond. And I just feel like the Lord took over at that point. And that was my response. I'm thinking it's kind of an out-of-body experience, like, who just said that to this man? And then our conversation was obviously over, because he stood up and then I stood up and I left. So I went to my parents' house and I said, Mom and Dad, I have something I need to tell you. I was still very much in control. And I said, we are homeschooling Ty this year. Here's the research. Mom was a teacher. Mom, here's the research. It was like a little pamphlet, and you couldn't call it research. It was more of an explanation. And I said, Daddy, here are all my legal briefs. Dad was an attorney by training. And I said, you can see what's happened. The school board turned me down. Charlie Williams just threatened to put me in jail. My hearing is next week. I didn't want you to read about it in the newspaper. And by this point, I'm hysterical, and I leave. My poor parents. Well, if I didn't know what homeschooling was, how in the world were they going to know what homeschooling was? So I had always been their child that was a little bit of a maverick. And so I, and so that's a long story. But, I had worked for Strom Thurmond when I had been governor of Girl State, and I worked for Strom Thurmond when I was in high school. So in the 72 campaign, it was the first year of the 18-year-old vote, and I was female. So I traveled the state and spoke for him. And, it was the USC baseball coach who was like national winner, and me, and I can't remember who the third person was. So we were just kind of the tag team. And so I had done that in high school. Dad was a good friend of his. When Daddy got out of law school, Thurman offered him a position in his law firm. So what happened is, after I left, that night, Dad spoke. Oh, Daddy was also chairman of the Baptist Hospital System in South Carolina. So that night, Dad and Senator Thurman's wife spoke at the same function. And Dad says to Nancy, you need to call the senator, because Zan's in trouble. She's called his office, and I want to know what he's going to do for her now. So she comes back and says, Zan, Duke Short. I mean, I knew Duke. He was he ran the office, and said he's going to send a letter. He's going to overnight a letter to Charlie Williams. And they call back the next day, and they said, John, scrap that. The senator's flying in personally on Friday to meet with Charlie Williams and tell him to get off Zan's back. So I stopped this recording, which, of course, Strom Thurmond was a legend, and he knew me and he knew my dad. And of course, then my phone starts ringing off the hook. How are you today, Ms. Tyler? Come down to the State Department. We're going to get you all set for your hearing. You have nothing to worry about. The chairman of the Curriculum and Instructional Materials Committee, who was running my, when they were going to lynch me, calls and says, Zan, I think you went to Furman with my son, and we want you to come so we can meet you and Joe, but you have nothing to worry about.
And so the State Board of Education is now bending over backwards. How did your hearing end up going?
Oh, well, it was unanimous. They approved my program. And I will tell you, though, that first year of homeschooling, that was a happy launch into a very difficult and trying year. We had neighbors who wouldn't let we lived in a real close neighborhood. We had neighbors who wouldn't let their kids play with our boys anymore. It was a one way in, one way out neighborhood made up a lot of little cul-de-sacs. And there were policemen who would drive by my house. I could tell what they were. They were unmarked cars. I had phone calls almost every day from people wanting bizarre information from me. I think I was one of the first people in the state to get what was the Bell South call tracing service. Then, there's no caller ID. So Joe said, "Zan, you were so paranoid." I said, "I am not." Well, it turned out it was people from other school districts calling me, administrations from other school districts calling me, wanting to get information from me. And so it was, it was not an easy year. And I always worried about somebody coming in and taking my kids. I mean, we rarely went out during the daytime during school hours, and it was a little clandestine, even though I had been approved. Most people in South Carolina, I found out later, there were a couple of school districts that just approved people, and then there were a lot of people homeschooling underground, but very few at this period in time. So the year was really hard emotionally on me. But my kids were flourishing. And here's the crazy thing. I had been a stay-at-home mom. I had planned to go on law school after college, like my dad, so we could work together. And there were two things I said I'd never do in college. One was teach and the other was have kids. And so I spent my adult life teaching my kids at home, or at least 21 years of it, which I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. It's the most fulfilling life I can ever imagine. But that first year, it was terrible. That's why I am such a believer in fighting for homeschool freedom and such a believer in HSLDA. I don't ever want any mom to go to bed at night feeling the way I used to feel that first year when I went to bed, not knowing, will I have my kids? When is the other shoe going to drop? Which is how I felt. No support groups, no state organizations, no HSLDA. I just felt like this crazy person out there, the person I knew right then and there that was homeschooling. So, but we got to the end of that first year, and I looked at Joe, who is a huge believer in homeschooling now, but the first year he just said, "This may be the craziest thing I've ever heard of, Zan, but I know how much you love the kids, and I totally trust your judgment. So of course we'll homeschool." So we get to the end of the second year, and at the end of that first year, and I said, "Joe, I don't know how to say this, and you know how hard this year has been, but the changes I've seen in my children and in Ty and our family is so amazing. Even though I was a stay-at-home mom before, I really just feel like we need to do that. I just feel like the Lord is calling us to do this another year." And he looked at me, he said, "Yeah, I was kind of afraid that was coming."
So what was Joe doing at this time?
He was working in the corporate world.
So he was he was supportive but skeptical.
Yes, very skeptical. He told me in his rousing response of support to me when we started homeschooling, he said, "Well, it's just kindergarten. A kid just learns their numbers and colors and shapes. So how much can you mess him up?" I said, "Yeah." Thanks. And then it turns out Ty was colorblind and he wasn't learning his numbers, and we couldn't figure out why.
So you're sort of transporting us back to a time that a lot of people only know about through myth and legend. I mean, but it was real back then. The early homeschool parents actually kept their curtains closed. And, we hear stories about people who, would leave out the front door at
Oh,
the
I've got those stories coming too, out the back
you,
door.
you
Crawling
got
out.
them coming, huh?
Yes.
Did you have any actual real live contact with any of the law enforcement people during that first year, or was it just kind of the?
Mm-mm. It was, it was just intimidation.
Hmm.
And I just always felt like somebody was watching me. And it was, which that was okay. I just felt like somebody was watching my kids. That was
Mhm.
not okay. And
Is
so,
that still a tender spot for you after all
oh,
those years?
it's the driving force in my life. People ask me why I'm still involved in homeschooling all these years later. Well, the first reason is because it works, and it's a wonderful way to raise your kids. But the second thing is I just, the state organizations and the co-ops and working with publishers. I mean, my whole goal has been to provide the support for homeschool moms that I would have died to have those first
Hmm.
few years I homeschooled and didn't have at all. And so it's really, it's a tender spot, and it's a tender spot I think that the Lord uses to keep me wanting to serve and wanting to improve and wanting to fight for freedoms and make sure we don't take any of these things we have for granted.
Hmm. Yeah, over the years when we've gotten together at conferences and spoken about these things, I'm just going to tell you, you have been an inspiration.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
I mean, to me personally, and to the whole movement, really. Just the times that you and Joe and Debbie and I have gotten together and hearing your stories and just seeing your heart and just realizing, the sacrifices that you and others made in those early years that really make it possible for us to even be talking about this today in this remarkable, amazing day where homeschooling is free and growing like crazy. And
in half the world is homeschooling. If you had
yeah,
told me that in '84, I thought you'd lost your mind. But yeah, so
well, let's don't get to today too fast. Let's go
okay.
back and recount those early years that led to you becoming this homeschool leader that you are today.
Okay, so we decided to homeschool the second year. We are actually approved without too much trouble. Ty had to be tested, and he did fine on the testing, and so they approved us the next year. So I'm beginning to get a lot of phone calls at this point in time from not so much people who want to know about homeschooling, but lawyers and literacy foundations and people from around the country. I don't know, there was no social media. I don't know how they knew my story because I wasn't telling it. And and I just started developing a database of people and names and on my little Tandy 1000. and and just of anybody who called me, I would just write down their name and contact information. Well, so now we're in the fall of 1985, and one night, about 11 o'clock, it may have been midnight, I get a knock on the front door. Well, isn't that what we all fear, is the midnight knock? And I was up working. I was always up working, with what was coming up next. And so I answered the door, and it was a friend of mine, a neighbor. And he actually was in charge of a state agency. And so he says to me, and he was African American, and his son was my son's best friend. So he said, Zan, how I feel about homeschooling. I don't like it, but we love you. And so you need to know what's going on. Do you know what the state register is? I said, no, I don't have any idea. He said, well, that's where state agencies like mine or other people can see what's going on. And I just found these regulations that the State Department of Education has promulgated for homeschooling. and you're not going to like it. You need to see this. So he had copied it for me, and it just basically said the State Department was promulgating regulations that would require teaching parents to have a college degree from a state approved, from an accredited university, which leaves out Harvard and a couple of other colleges. And you could only use state approved text, no Christian text, which for me was hugely significant. And he said, "Dan, the way this works, can't remember the exact number of days, but if it sits in the state register for like 90 days, these regulations that have been promulgated just become law. They don't have to be voted on by the legislature." And he said, "So you need to do something about this before this takes effect." And I just thought, well, this was just God's gift in the form of a neighbor. So I called my attorney again. And because I know HSLDA had started on the West Coast in '83. And I think I had a conversation with Mike Smith way back in the day, but it was nothing that HSLDA was doing nationwide at that point in time.
So for those listening, Mike Smith is one of the founders of HSLDA. And his story is not unlike Zan's, in that about that same time, he and his wife decided to homeschool, and they were unusual at the time in Southern California, where he was practicing law. And he got together with Mike Ferris from Washington State, also an attorney, and together they founded HSLDA in 1983, but on a very limited sort of, startup kind of basis. So here we are now, about 1985.
Yeah, 1985. Yep. And so my attorney said, "Zan, you've got to get in." I think it was 25 letters. You've got to have people send 25 letters to the State Department of Education requesting a public hearing on these regulations. So that stops those regulations from going into effect.
So you found 25 other homeschoolers, or just 25 other people? Were you like recruiting bums off the street? Here, sign this letter. What did you do?
This is crazy. By this time, Joe and I had gone to this little conference in Atlanta, and they had 6 or 7 people there from South Carolina. But the hilarious thing about it was, Jim, nobody would give anybody else their name or contact information because everybody was afraid you might be a plant. I mean, there was real fear out there. So somehow I don't know. These names and addresses I had started collecting the year before. And as people would call me, and 1 or 2 people would move to town who had been homeschooling in other states, I just collected them. I sent out letters. So I sent out my first letter, and I said, "I need your help. I've got to have 25 letters going to this person, Dr. Carnes, in the State Department of Education." And, nobody's doing word processing then. And I said, "Will you please carbon copy me on your letters so I know when we get up to 25, it's the only proof I'll have."
So I feel like we need to help the millennials out there. Carbon copy, that little CC you see down on letters that you type into your word processor, actually had a piece of carbon paper that went behind the paper that had another piece of paper that you typed, and it made a really blurry blue carbon copy of things. I mean, so this is a remarkable thing that the back when homeschooling was started compared to today, just think how life has changed. Oh, it's amazing.
Everything was so much more trouble.
And still homeschooling got off the ground.
Yes. That is God's hand of blessing. All I have to say to that. But I can remember when I got my 25th letter, I ended up getting like 50 letters. I wish I'd kept those. But who knew this was going to be part of a movement? I didn't know that. And so I remember going up to see Ernest Carnes, and I remember it because I was significantly pregnant, and I had to walk up 9 flights of stairs because they had lost their power at the State Department of Education. So this is a vivid memory for me. And I walk in to say, here are my 25 letters, and to call for a public hearing. And I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Now, you have to understand, now that wouldn't bother me a bit. I would say, you want to fight? Come on, buddy, let's fight. But this was all new to me, and I was scared to death. And so he was rude. He took the letters and told me he would be in touch. And so I'm not sure exactly why I'm giving you all this history. So,
well, I love this history, and let me pause you right there. And here's why I'm getting all this history, and it's why I love hearing it, and it's why it's important for people out there to know it. So I did a podcast a few weeks ago with a historian named Wilfred McClay, and I did a podcast with him because I had bought his history book, U.S. history book for high school students. And there's a paragraph in there that has just really stood out to me. And I'm going to read it now.
Okay.
This is from his history book, Land of Hope. And he's talking about like the decade leading up to the Civil War, before the Civil War started. And he says, when we look back to a moment in the past, it is hard not to read into it. Nearly everything that we know is to come after it. We can't help but see it as something carrying along with itself a future that we already know about, an awareness that gives us a perspective very different from that of the participants in the past moment. And so you're giving us the participant in that moment perspective, not knowing how it's going to turn out, and not knowing that, 30, 40 years down the road, homeschooling is going to be what it is today. And so this is why it's really important to get this all down, because, any movement that began from nothing and grows to this, who knew? And you didn't know at the time what was going to happen.
No, absolutely not. And so this is turning into 1985 is turning into 1986, and I'm expecting, and I lose a baby between 5 and 6 months, when I'm 5 and 6 months pregnant, and almost died in the delivery room. I mean, it was really remarkable that I had lived. And I only tell this story because the next day, as Joe and I are recovering from this loss, I'm in the hospital, and I check my answering machine at home, and it's the State Department of Education saying, this is your 90-day notice for the public hearing we're calling, or a 60-day notice, 60 or 90-day notice, for our public hearing on these regulations. So it was, in effect, the notice of the first public hearing we ever had on homeschooling in South Carolina. And I had a limited window of time to get in the speakers we wanted to have. So later, when I was going through my notes, I found this yellow legal pad of all the notes Joe and I were taking, and they're just stained with tears because we're having to do all of this from my hospital room. And, we have no staff or no people we can pass this off to. This is just us. And so we lost joy, and we went home, and we, in the midst of all this, we start planning this public hearing. So we were, Dr. Moore, I had gotten to be closer to him because I had read his book, and he and Dorothy had started helping me a little bit just understand homeschooling.
So that's Dr. Raymond Moore.
Yes, that's right.
Many people trace kind of the beginning of homeschooling to the radio broadcast on the Dobson.
Yes. Yeah. And there were 2 of those that were just, groundbreaking. One like in 83 and one in 85 there, or 86, that really impacted me. And it was just great confirmation. So, all right, so we're talking about this public hearing. So we bring in Dr. Moore. We, Joe and I are living on one income, and we've had legal expenses, and now we need to pay for him to be an expert witness. And I dealt with his foundation. Dr. Moore was lovely, but I still had to pay his expenses and his honorarium. And so Joe and I were, just wondering, how is this all going to work? And so I get a call about maybe a week before the public hearing that says, Zan, your side has 15, 30 minutes. I can't remember. By this time I had met parents, and I had a pastor who wanted to speak, and Dr. Moore was going to take 15 to 20 minutes, and I was going to speak. So we had a full, a little robust roster of people who were going to speak to homeschooling. And he says, yeah, you've got 15 minutes. And I mean, I've already paid in advance all these things. And I mean, I was just sick. Well, it was the same man who had given me a hard time in the State Department of Education from the very beginning. And so just talking to my dad, my dad was just very savvy about these kinds of things and had lots of friends. So he calls me back a few minutes later, and he said, Zan, I talked to the chairman of the committee who's going to be running the hearing. And he said, if you want to take 6 hours, you can take 6 hours. This is his hearing, not the Department of Education's hearing. So, we ended up, I guess there were probably 400 people who came, Jim. I still don't know where all these people came from. And Dr. Moore said, Zan, just set up a little seminar. I'll speak for 2 hours or 1 hour, however long people want me to stay. So we rented a room in a local college. And he said, just charge $25. Well, we're not nonprofit or anything. And so people, we have this seminar. It's like, I tell you what it's like. It's after COVID and you haven't seen anybody for a year and a half. All these people who are thinking about homeschooling or have heard the word homeschooling and they're actually homeschooling and nobody knew the other person existed, they're just handing me money. And for me, it was a lot of money. I mean, it was like a $10 bill and a $20 bill. And I'm thinking, well, we might eat tonight. This is great. And when it was all said and done, it paid all of our expenses.
Wow.
For that.
So that was the first homeschool conference in South Carolina.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I've never thought about it that way. And so, of course, after all this hearing, all of our testimony, which actually we did a really good job of preparing our people and presenting our side, and Dr. Moore was excellent. And we just get a notice in the mail, the regulations are going through, it didn't make a bit of difference. So that's when I realized I was going to have to do something legislatively. Now, I had been politically involved a little bit as a teen. I had been governor of Girl State and did this won the state citizenship award. So I was doing a little bit of speaking, and I was politically involved and worked in a campaign, speaking here and there. But I didn't know anything about lobbying, or I didn't even know I was trying to get a law passed. I was just looking for relief. I mean, pure and simple, get rid of these regulations. I mean, I could meet the 4-year college degree thing, and I could use state-approved text if I wanted to. But at this point, it was just these principles that were becoming really important to me, that any parent should have the right to homeschool their kids, and any parent should have the right to use the curriculum of their choice. So we were really fighting against using certified teachers and using state-approved curriculum. And it was costing people a lot of money. This was not an easy thing to do at this point in time. So I went and saw my senator. And it was interesting because when I was governor of Girl State, which most people won't even know now, but it was this high school program, and you went, and met at the State House, and you had this election. 2 people from every high school went in the state. Well, one of my best friends there that I got to know outside my own high school was Senator Gazay's daughter. And so I called Senator Gazay, and I said, Senator Gazay, I don't know if you remember me, but Beasley was a really good friend of mine, and I've got a problem. He said, oh, come on down. I'd heard this before. Come on down, honey. I'm here to help. And I got there. Well, Senator Gazay had also been the USC, University of South Carolina football coach, and had gotten his PhD in education after he retired from coaching. So he really does know education because he's got this PhD. And he knows me and he loves me. And I start telling him everything I've been through. And it was like, Jim, it was like there was somebody to help me all of a sudden. And I mean, by the end of, I spent about 2.5 hours with him, and I'm sobbing by the end of it. He said, Zan, you mean you have been going through this? They put you through this? They did this to you? And he said, oh, we're not doing this anymore. We're not doing this anymore. I'm your sponsor. I'm your helper. I'm your aide. I am here for you. And he said, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call a hearing, a public hearing. And I can't remember if it was through the Senate or the House. There was some stipulation. And he said, whatever it takes, we'll get this hearing moving. And so by this time now, we had the State Department hearing in May of 1986. I met with Senator Gazay during the summer, and he calls for a hearing in the legislative session of 1987. So all of a sudden, I get to know Chris Klicka, and Chris is coming down for this hearing. So things are just beginning to explode a little bit in homeschooling. And when I say explode, I don't mean half the world is homeschooling. I'm thinking we have several hundred people in the state now who are homeschooling, which is really remarkable.
So Chris Klicka was the first full-time lawyer hired by HSLDA way back in the day. And the story is that Mike Ferris and Mike Smith hired Chris Klicka because he had done an internship or something with a law group, John Whitehead's law group, and had written an article about how to legally homeschool across America. And so Mike Ferris read the article and says, we got to have you. Now, and Chris, I don't think was even married yet. He certainly didn't have kids, and he hadn't started homeschooling.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
So he just had a zeal for this notion of parents being able to raise their kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord in the way that they thought best, wrote a law review article that came to the attention of the founders of HSLDA, and that's what caused him to be hired as the first full-time lawyer. And so today, we were just doing, with all the different things that we do, we have over 200 full and part-time employees, including our online academy and our consultants and our communications team and our legal team. We've gone from back then, Chris Klicka, to what we are today.
It is really amazing. So I get the word out. I write these letters and we get the word out, and we have our hearing. I want to say, I'll have to go back and check my records, but I think it was through the House Education and Public Works Committee. But Senator Gazay was really the moving force. And he was kind of schooling me and coaching me through all of this. And he said, now, Zan, politicians can't do a lot of things, but they can count. And so you get all your people there. Well, Jim, we had, maybe this is the hearing, we had somewhere between 500 and 600 people at this hearing. I mean, it's overflowing. And this is really before the day of grassroots movements. And we have television cameras coming out of, I mean, just coming from everywhere, wondering, what is this? What has caused so much commotion down at the State House that all these people are here? And so and it was all just to contest those regulations. And so at the end of the day, they took a vote. I mean, we had so many people there, it was overwhelming. That day, the House Education and Public Works had to vote on the regulations. So that's why they did it. And they just tore up the regulations and said, these are done, these are finished. So I can remember I went home, and by this point, it sounds like nothing, but at this point, I am physically and emotionally exhausted. I've just had all these threats and and feeling like I can't go out during the daytime and people not speaking to us, so family members not speaking. I mean, it was horrible. And then we lost the baby and my health was compromised. And all of a sudden we have a little bit of good news. I looked at Joe, I said, I'm going home and I'm going to bed for 3 days. And please take the time off from work. Don't come upstairs. I don't want to see anybody. I want to lay in my bed and I want to sleep for 3 days. And which sounds so silly, but it was, oh my word, Jim, it was so stressful. Always so stressful all the time. And so the next morning, Joe came and woke me up and he said, Zan, you need to take this phone call. And I said, Joe, I don't want to move. I just want to. And he said, no, trust me. So it was a young legislator. His name was David Beasley. And he said, Zan, I need you to come down here because I know what the State Department of Education has planned now that you beat these regs, and you're not going to like it. But I'm going to file some legislation like Georgia. I mean, all of our states around us have good, nobody else is going through this. And he said, where all homeschoolers will have to do is send a notice of intent and not get permission anymore. And he said, but I need you to come down here now. So I got dressed and went down to the State House. And David and I worked on that. He showed me what he was going to file. He filed the legislation. So the end of the story is one of us remained a peon, and David went on to become governor of South Carolina and just recently won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work globally.
Wow.
And so anyway, so that started a whole new round. So once that legislation was filed, I got a call from the chairman of the Senate Education Committee. His name was Ed Garrison. And he said, Zan, this may work in Georgia, but this is not working here. And he said, I'll appoint you to an ad hoc committee and we'll draft some legislation together with the State Department of Education and the Senate Education Committee. But this, we're not having Georgia's legislation here. So to make a really long story short, we got together and, my goal was twofold, that parents only had to have a GED or, not a college degree, and that we could use any textbooks we wanted to. And so by the time we had finished, by this time we had an association going, the South Carolina Home Educators Association, and David Walters was the president and I was the legislative liaison. And so he and I both served on that. I don't remember who else served on that ad hoc committee. And so by the time we finished, for those who are interested, this was 596540 in the South Carolina Code of Laws. And it gave 6 or 7 things that homeschoolers had to do, but school boards had to approve them. It was no longer you can approve them or not approve them. And so you only had to have a GED. You could use any curriculum you wanted to. You just had to tell your school board, we have a curriculum. But then you had to teach 4.5 hours a day. You had to keep a logbook. You had to have your kids tested, yada, 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 yada. So there were these 7 things. And even then, the State Department of Education pulled their support from this because they didn't want us to have it that easy. So it took us the 87 and 88 school year, legislative years, to get that bill passed. And it was put on the contested calendar. Again, my dad called. There were some maneuverings behind the scene and we got it off the contested calendar. So once we got it off the contested calendar, we felt like we had the votes to get this bad bill passed, but it was so much better than anything we had ever known. But on the last day of debate in the House, a representative added the EEE amendment, which said that if parents don't have a college degree, they have to make a passing score on the education entrance exam to be able to homeschool. Well, by this point, everybody was sick of homeschooling. The bill passed the House and the Senate, and this, we had a year off before the EEE took effect, and so we had a glorious year, and then the EEE took effect. And in this, after the bill passed, this is when I got to know Mike Ferris. So
the triple E, the infamous triple E case is a good place to bring Mike Ferris in, because it was one of HSLDA's early big cases.
yes.
So tell us again, what is triple E?
Okay, Triple E is the education entrance exam, and it was an exam that college students had to take and pass in order to become an education major. And so that was the genesis of the test. But I didn't understand it then, but I think it was the attack all along of, the School Boards Association or school administrators, not just in South Carolina, but nationally, that wanted to do front-end credentialing of parents. In other words, we're not just going to test your kids at the end of the school year to see how they're doing. We're going to require a certain list of credentials from the teaching parent. And so that was the beginning of this. So I called Mike Ferris for the first time. I tried to get Mike a couple of times, and I introduced myself, and he said, this is a horrible law that just passed. And I said, yes, I'm well aware this is a horrible law. And he said, well, how did you let this happen? And I said, well, it was not intentional, I can assure you. So, but then, it was just really great because we started working together, and Mike was fabulous. So we basically had a year grace period between 1988 and 1989, where people didn't have to have that. We didn't have to use state-approved text. Nobody had to have a college degree. And so that was just really a glorious year. So it was during that time that Mike came in and started working on a class action suit against the Triple E. And I know that you can probably tell the ins and outs a lot better. I was actually appointed as part of a panel. We actually went through, and we would look at every question on the test and say, is this information a homeschool parent has to have in order to be able to homeschool well? And, it's a long test. And so I took copious notes. My dad had always taught me that handwritten notes are admissible in court, just like any other notes. So, I've got daddy's legal mind schooling me a little bit in all of this. And then, of course, Mike was brilliant in all of this. And, but we had this panel meeting with the Triple E, and it's made up of mostly public school educators. So I raised my hand and I asked the question. I said, what if I don't think any of these questions is information a homeschooling mom has to know to homeschool well? Mm-hmm. And I say no to all of them. Well, they said we would probably throw your analysis out. Well, I wrote this down in my notes, and that actually became a big factor in the whole lawsuit. Maybe not. Anyway, you'll have to ask Mike about the ins and outs of that. So it's just really interesting how those things work. So we had, the Triple E lawsuit filed, and just people right and left coming in from other states now to homeschool, who they'd have to wait till the test was offered. Once the Triple E kicked in, it was really a nightmare. And so we lost the Triple E case at the lower court level. And that really, I don't remember the year on that. And then David Beasley, my friend, had become the chairman of the House Education Committee at this point in time. And I went to see him. I said, David, what can we do? And he said, I think, Zan, we can, so this would be for the legislative session of 1990. And he said, I think we can pass a technical amendment act where it would either be parents have a GED or a passing score on the Triple E. And we'll just change, instead of the and, we'll change it to or. It's considered a technical amendment. I think we can get that passed. So in February of that year, there was it was the Silver Elephant Dinner for the Republicans, and there were 3 senators then that were really helping me. And they came up to me and said, Zan, we can't work on a homeschooling bill this session. He said, we've got an abortion bill we're working on. And he said, we just can't handle two. I mean, they were my friends. They were being honest. They just said, we can't handle two bills that seem to be emotionally and religiously aligned. And so we can't do it. And really, Jim, I think that was the most I've been depressed in the whole homeschooling journey, because it was like, it was like Narnia. It was always winter and never Christmas. And we couldn't win anything. We couldn't catch a break. Oh, my word. It was just awful. So I went home that night, and after I cried my eyeballs out, when I get really depressed, I clean up my desk and file my papers. And so if you ever walk into my office and it's clean, I'm depressed. And I came across a memo my attorney had sent me, the one I had worked with. And he said, Zan, start an accrediting agency for homeschoolers like SCISA. So this gets complicated, but it's just it was complicated for me, then. South Carolina Independent Schools Association. And what people in the audience may not know is that every state has its own compulsory attendance laws, and they can look entirely different than the other 49 compulsory attendance laws, because it's supposed to be a state function and not a federal function. And so our state compulsory attendance law said your child could either be go to a public school, a parochial school, there was a third category, and then or be a member of SCISA, which was the private accrediting South Carolina Independent Schools Association, the private school accrediting association. And so he said, start one of those for homeschoolers. There's nothing in the code of laws that says homeschoolers can't be private schoolers. So I started doing my research. I think I called Mike like at 10 or 11 o'clock that night. And I said, Mike, I just found this memo. I've talked to the attorney here. I'm thinking about starting an organization. It has to be similar, because it said a kid has to be a member of SCISA or some similar organization. But I'm thinking about starting a similar organization, taking homeschooling out of the public sector, starting a private, a private sector, and just getting rid of all of this. Do you think it'll work? And he said, yeah, I'm thinking it'll work. Call me in the morning. So I began setting up SCAES at that point in time, South Carolina Association of Independent Homeschools. We incorporated in June. I met with all the private school people in the state. I mean, their board and some executives. And I said, I'm not trying to drag you through the homeschool mud, but this is my legal option. And he said, Zan, just keep really good test records. Your kids do great academically. In 2 years, you're going to end up in court. Just make sure you've kept the test scores. So we incorporated, I think in July of 1990, 2 or 3 months later, 11 families in Lexington County were charged with truancy. And this was where parents were served with notices at night. And sometimes the sheriff or whoever it was serving them would have the bright spotlight and want to see the kids involved. And this was our story of, we had phone trees. We don't even have fax machines at this point, so we have phone trees, and people are calling each other, and people are calling me, and people are leaving the state so that they can go, be with their in-laws or somewhere in Georgia or anywhere but South Carolina. And so I just remember calling Mike. And I can remember sitting in a house with Mike on the speakerphone, and several of these families saying, okay, what are we going to do now? And so we were able to, all right, so this just gets so complicated, but the EEE now has been appealed to the South Carolina Supreme Court. We have several school districts who want to file lawsuits against SCAES, because I'm not requiring a college degree or state approved text, So, and the college degree is still in play. And we were able, one of our friends in the legislature said, Zan, let me get an attorney general's opinion. You might get a positive opinion on SCAES. And if he says people can homeschool legally through SCAES, a lot of these lawsuits will go away and we can see what happens with the Triple E. Well, I'll never forget the morning that I got a call from my one friend at the State Department of Education. Said, Zan, I'm just giving you advance warning. We've gotten a negative attorney general's opinion on SCAES. The state superintendent of education, who was better at this point, we had helped get her elected, had sent out a fax. Maybe we have faxes at this point to all 91 or 92 of our local school superintendents saying that everybody who's going through SCAES is illegal, and your name is, of course, at the top of every blacklist in the state. And she said, I just wanted to warn you that this is what's happening. And so I just had a few, I can count the 3 or 4 times that I had real meltdowns, during this process. This was one of them. And I just remember sitting at my dining room table. The kids, we had enclosed our garage. It was our schoolroom. And so they were all occupied. And I just sat at my dining room table and I wept and I cried. And I happened to glance out my dining room window, and there are 2 policemen walking down my sidewalk. But these are tense guys. They're big guys, and they've got their hands on their gun. Their hands on their guns. And I'm thinking, do they think I'm gonna fight back? I don't know. But Lord, that was quick. I just got this call, and here are these policemen. So I ran in my schoolroom. And the boys were probably 12 and 10. Lizzie was 3. And I just told my oldest, I said, you go upstairs, lock yourself in a room. Do not come down. I don't care what you hear downstairs. Do not come downstairs. I just didn't want my 3-year-old seeing me handcuffed, with the police car. And I said, then call Papa, my daddy. He'll know what to do. He'll come get you. Do not come down until you know I'm gone. Okay, Mom. Okay. And I said, and if I hear y'all fighting upstairs.
And pick up that room while you're at it.
So I found out later from the kids that they had gone upstairs. They had locked the door and they had all 3 gotten under the bed together. And so the policeman called me outside and they just start asking me questions. And I'm thinking, these are odd questions. And they finally said, Miss Tyler, there have been, like I said, we live in a quiet little neighborhood. There have been some armed robberies in your neighborhood today, and we think the thief is in your backyard.
Oh boy.
And I said, praise the Lord. You said armed thieves in the backyard. I can handle that. Let me at them.
The only person ever to thank the Lord for a thief in their backyard.
That's right. And I said, why do you think you're here? Well, so I told you, at this point, we've been living on one income and paying legal fees every time we turn around. And so we buy a car from high school, which was a very new sports car then, is a very old car by now. And if Joe had customers in town, he'd take the good minivan. And he said, you see that car out there? That's a sports car. It's a big engine, but it's old and decrepit. But we feel like that's their getaway car. I said, oh, no. That's my car. And they said, lady, tell your husband to buy you a new car. But, and I laugh about that all the time. But, Jim, when I had to face the fact that I was probably going to jail that morning, it was like the Lord said, okay, Zan, I've got you, I've got this, I've got your kids, and I want you to quit worrying. And after that, I was just really a different person. Mike was not only an attorney, he was a great counselor. And he would talk to me all the time about faith and fear. And he just helped me walk through so many of those things. But this was a defining moment for me. And we, to make a very long story a lot shorter. So we got news in the, so by this time I'm thinking it's 91, and it's the October of 91. We had oral arguments on the Triple E. I say we, I feel like it was my lawsuit too. And Mike just danced circles around the legal representation for the state. So after the oral arguments, the attorney for the Attorney General's office and the State Department of Education asked me to go to lunch, and they said, "Hey, Zan, what can we do to make these lawsuits go away? Because at this point, it's time the state had used up all their money for depositions, and HSLDA is continuing to depose people for the Triple E case." They said, "We don't get paid overtime. You're not the enemy." Barbara Nielsen, the state superintendent of education, says, "You're no longer the enemy. So let's get all this gone." And so he said, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, I want a law that says people, that name SCAES in the compulsory attendance law. So you've got SCISA, SCAES, or other similar organizations. And that way it left room for other homeschooling organizations, just not SCAES." And they looked at me and they said, "Okay, we can't do that." And I said, "Well, I will see you guys in court." And so because I had now, I've got HSLDA behind me. I've got a little bit of bargaining room and more guts, And so they called me 2 weeks later and they said, "Okay." And they said, "We don't like Mike Ferris." As a matter of fact, I think they said, "We hate Mike Ferris, and we don't like you much better, but we trust you both. We know that you're people of integrity. So here's what we'll do. We'll give you a one-item statute that says, in lieu of public school supervision, people can join SCAES and be accountable to your academic standards." And they said, we'll try to get this passed in the 1992 session. We will keep some of your enemies from fighting against you, and we'll even help you with the legislative strategy. Wow. And and then I think it was December of 1991. It might have been November. I'll never forget. Okay, this just makes me cry every time I tell the story. So it's just a normal homeschooling morning. And Mike and Chris and everybody from HSLDA are on the speakerphone, and they're saying, "Zan, we won the Triple E. We want you to go downtown, pick up the decision, and overnight it to us." And it was like, Jim, I could hear the walls of Jericho falling. And of course then, because now nobody, not the school districts, nobody are requiring a college degree, this opens up the legislative session and the law for a SCAES law and takes the biggest mitigating factor out of it. We still, that's a whole nother story. The SCAES law passed in April of 1992. And when you and I have another hour on our own, I'll tell you that story. It still shouldn't have happened. And we still had enemies who tried to kill it. But it was amazing that it passed in 4 months. And we just went from a horrible state for homeschooling overnight to a free state. And it was glorious, glorious, glorious.
Well, Zan, that's an amazing story. I never tire of hearing it. Thank you so much for telling it, but more importantly, thanks for living through that and having the courage to answer the Lord's call on your life. This has been part one of my podcast, Homeschool Talks with Zan Tyler, a remarkable homeschool leader from South Carolina. And when we come back for the next episode, we're going to be asking Zan to fast forward to an article that she wrote just recently called "When Homeschool Generations Link Arms." I'm going to ask her how that article came into being and what she's learned in all these years of homeschool leadership. So Zan, thank you so much. And I'll see you next podcast.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law. And we'll represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To learn more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you enjoyed this conversation, leave a review to let us know what you think. To hear more conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to this podcast or head on over to hslda.org/podcast for more inspiring stories and awesome ideas about homeschooling. That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you next time.